Hello, everyone. This is Eva Norlyk Smith with YogaUOnline, and I'm very pleased to be here today with Stu Girling, certified.
Thanks for inviting me.
Yeah, it's great to have you. And Stu, I like to think of you as like a certified anatomy nerd as opposed to a certifiable anatomy nerd.
Yeah, that would make sense. Definitely seemed to be a bit of an obsession.
So Stu, you're the founder of YogaUOnline-founder and I would say you're one of the people who are becoming experts in what really is a rapidly growing field of yoga anatomy. And your website, YogaUOnline-founder is a go-to resource for all things related to yoga anatomy. So I really appreciate you taking the time to join us today and talk anatomy.
Thanks for having me. It's such a weird feeling because I've watched so many of your interviews with teachers that I really respect. So it's quite strange to find myself in this situation now, but I'm more than happy to be here.
Yeah, well, we love people who make anatomy fun, and you definitely fall into that category.
I try. Anyway, I think for myself, if it isn't, it can be like a tremendously dry subject if you're not careful. And I find for myself, I need it to come alive, to actually have some interest and make me want to know about it too. So hopefully I'll pass that on to everybody else as well.
Yeah. And I think there is a growing awareness in the yoga community of just how important it is to integrate more anatomy that specializes in anatomy for yoga practice. And we have a lot of discussion about making yoga available to everybody and helping to train teachers who can do more than just teaching people who are already fit, who are able-bodied, who are skinny, who fits like the yoga body model.
Exactly, if it's in the nice little category of can do it already, really.
Yeah, exactly. But I think one of the things that we're just starting to recognize in the yoga community is that you cannot really teach everybody unless you learn to recognize the differences between everyone, you know, anatomy-wise, and how we teach differently to different bodies.
For sure. It's a big problem, particularly with the logistics or the financial implications of running classes. For the majority of people, they have to run multi-level classes, which in itself is a problem because how do you deal with everybody of varying abilities within the same class?
Right.
And I think the more that you know about the body, the more it can influence your sequencing and the more you'll have available modifications at the right time, and the more you can customize your class on the fly. So I think the more information teachers have available to them, then the much more easy they're going to be able to adapt their class to suit the individuals, rather than be a little bit afraid because they think, well, this is what I'm comfortable with, this is what I know. And so I'm just going to stick with it. But actually, probably it might suit a few people in the class, but the rest of them are just going to have to sort of hang tough and hope that nothing goes wrong.
Right. Yeah, exactly. And I think, you know, one of the things that has been holding back this process is, you know, there's like a lot of anatomy out there, but there's not that much work that has been done in like, what does specialized anatomy for yoga teaching look like? And I think that's sort of becoming your life's work, or one of the things that I'm sure you have other parts of your life that are, but you're really specializing in helping to develop this area.
I think it probably came from my background, really. I started in gyms, and so I learned a lot of anatomy in those days to do with specialized as far as bodybuilding, when working on fitness, working on endurance or whatever. So even in those days, it was relatively specialized to what I was doing. But then I learned massage, and therapeutic massage, and what I found was that the anatomy that we were given in the therapeutic massage was just a generic, out of the box module that you could literally plonk into any sort of course that needed, you know, a tick in the box to say it had an anatomy module. And when I was doing it, it was like, well, yeah, okay, this is telling us what we're placing our hands on, shall we say, but what good is it? What can we actually do with this information? And everybody was in the same boat in the class. They were just thinking, well, okay, yeah, it's something we have to learn, but in order to be able to practice. But what are we going to do with it once we start to do therapeutic massage? We're basically just going to throw it out the window, really, because it was of no use whatsoever. And so when I started thinking about applying the knowledge that I had to yoga people and the yoga practice, as much for myself as for everybody else, really, it was, you know, what is it that is directly applicable to the yoga practice? I'm not really interested in, you know, for myself, I couldn't really care less how many bones there are in the body or how many muscles there are in the body, or maybe even what muscle moves the little toe, because it doesn't really impact on the yoga practice. And so my two big passions really were the yoga practice itself and anatomy as it relates to the yoga practice. So it was always about, you know, making it super applicable and also interesting. And it becomes interesting when you can apply it and when you can use it and deconstruct poses and make sensible sequences and all that sort of thing. So I really hope, you know, there's a lot more out there now than there ever used to be, with people actually logically applying the knowledge, but and hopefully that's a trend, because we want it as a tool. Basically, we want it as much as we would, you know, we want to understand the breathing for pranayama. We might want to understand the mind as far as meditation. We want to understand anatomy directly as it applies to the body, because we're using our body within the yoga practice, the physical yoga practice anyway. So that really is my key focus for everybody else, but also for me, because actually I'm not so worried otherwise, unless it applies to the yoga practice itself.
Right. Yeah, and I think it's one of the great shocks for new yoga teachers when they come out and they start teaching and they have, say, 10 students in the class and they teach triangle pose, and everyone is doing a different version of triangle pose and they're all wrong.
Exactly.
And you just don't know where to start.
No.
But if you have the anatomy tools, you will know, okay, well, when triangle pose looks like this is usually what's going on in the person's body.
It can still be confusing, can't it? But at least it gives you some sort of insight into what might be going on. Yeah,
and you know a little bit more about how to build it up so that you avoid those early stages where it goes wrong, you know, and don't try to fix it once the whole thing is out of alignment.
It's fallen out. Yeah, it's always about, you know, getting to the essence of the posture. It doesn't really matter what it looks like, does it? It's if this is a twist, well, am I twisting? And if it is a twist, where am I twisting from? Does that make sense? Or is it all going into a lumbar area, which really shouldn't be twisting? And so the more you can get into it, the more it allows you to say, well, okay, actually, this person would just be better to forget that posture, because it's just too complicated and everything is falling to bits. And really, all we want them to do is twist. So let's do something like, you know, just an active seated twist would be so much better for them than trying to get their arm around here or do this and that and whatever. So, as you say, the more you can use it as a tool to guide your knowledge in the practice and the sequence of the poses, then the safer you'll look after your students as well. And also the more they'll get out of it.
Yeah. And we've done like a fair bit of work on YogaUOnline with musculoskeletal imbalances. There's a fair number of teachers like Julie Goodmistad, Melissa Sullivan, and other people with a PT background who's done a lot of work focusing on how muscle imbalances affect yoga postures. So the
Yeah.
classical example, of course, are tight hamstrings, and the many, many, many different ways they cause misalignment in varying yoga postures. But your work focuses also on one level, I don't want to say down or up, but like another level.
Just go sideways.
Sideways, which is the bony structure, the skeleton, and the structure of our joints. Do you want to talk about that?
Yeah, for sure. Well, underneath the soft tissue, of course, we have our bony structure, the skeletal structure. And that does vary slightly between individuals. And we can have deeper sockets. We can have bony projections that come out a little bit further, or the fact that everything twists in the body. The bones aren't straight, so they twist. It might mean that particular bony prominence is a little bit more around the corner in one direction. So all that has an influence to the muscles that are attaching to this skeletal structure. So we're going to the sort of the base root and just really trying to appreciate, again, the potential for differences between individuals, and that it may be then that is why that their pelvis is not quite aligned, or that they feel a pinching in their hip when they start to take the leg out to the side. It isn't always, so the answer doesn't always lie in the soft tissue. The answer can lie down at the skeletal structure. And I think that's probably more problematic, because if it's in the soft tissue, then you can of course overstretch or damage that soft tissue, but generally it repairs quite well. But when we're thinking about the joints themselves, they don't heal anywhere nearly as well as the soft tissue does. So if we are under the mistaken belief that by going deeper in a particular posture, we're actually influencing the soft tissue, and actually for our particular body, we are actually more working into the joint itself and creating some damage, well, then we're completely turning the benefits of yoga on its head. And that has come to light more recently, with people being more aware that actually they have hurt themselves in the yoga practice. And it's unfortunate, because then they either can't practice anymore, or they have to take a lot of care of a particular area. And there's obviously areas that are more vulnerable than others, and that would be really the hip and the shoulder, the skeletal structure, and of course the spine. And any of those areas, if we inadvertently hurt them, it really impacts not only the yoga practice, but impacts our daily life as well, because we want to walk around, we want to be able to get things out of cupboards, we want to be able to sit, drive, all the rest of it. So I think it's very important to know all levels, not just get completely focused on the soft tissue.
Right. Yeah, and it's a really, really central question, because we have the saying in yoga, you want to work your intelligent edge. And I think we usually think about that in terms of the soft tissues. And one of the wonderful things about yoga is you can transform the soft tissues like so much. You know, if you start out with tight hamstrings, if you work intelligently, you can really, develop, what would be a more normal range of motions of the hamstrings. And same thing with a lot of muscles. If you know how to work with them, you can progress over time, make them stronger, make them more flexible.
Absolutely. People see dramatic changes, don't they?
Yeah. But then the question is always like, when is it muscle? When is it bone? And that's sort of the $1 million question that you have to work with in your practice.
Exactly. And in this short course that we did, that was really the key question that we were asking, really, and trying to travel around the body and explore that idea of whether, and the way we name it is as compression, if we're thinking about bone on bone or bone on soft tissue, to classify that sort of restriction. And so this is what the short course was about, is what are the telltale signs for us to try and identify whether it might be bone on bone or whether it is still a muscular or soft tissue restriction that's stopping us going where we want to go. Because it's important, and people don't jump to that straight away because it's not in their head. In their head it must be some sort of soft tissue restriction. So I'm just going to load these sandbags onto my knees and Baddha Konasana or butterfly posture and wait until they go down. And it might be just pushing the hip socket into the hip bone into the socket and actually causing some issue that you really didn't know. And if you're very sensitive in your body, then you pick up on this sort of stuff. You can sense, well, actually that doesn't really feel like it's the same sensation as I was getting in my hamstring or whatever. It feels different. It feels like it's in the joint, or it feels, there's a different sensation. But you have to be aware, and not everybody is open to that level of awareness or is ready for that level of awareness in their body. So it helps if you've got some guidelines as a sort of safety net. And also for teachers, because teachers can get a little bit excited, and particularly if they're in a body that has opened very easily themselves and don't really have any particular restrictions. And then you're faced with somebody that has got a potentially what looks like a stubborn body that's not cooperating really. They can get sometimes a bit excited and think, well, let's see, what can we do to change this? Because they want to help the individual attain the level of flexibility that they desire. But actually sometimes they're just not designed quite the same way as a teacher. And it's like, it's better that they just like, okay, we need to hold back a little bit and assess the situation and see whether this is really the case, that it is soft tissue, or whether it is a joint restriction in itself. Very,
very good point. And are there some poses that tend to be more red flag poses? You made reference to Baddha Konasana.
Yes, absolutely. Because of the way that each joint is structured, and we're talking about something coming in contact with something else that's going to stop that movement and either cause some direct pressure or create some levering action. It can only be in certain directions, and it can also only be in joints that are designed in such a way that that can happen. So, for instance, the knee, we can certainly damage the knee, and many yoga practitioners unfortunately do damage the meniscus in the knee due to levering actions that are going on. And that would be again where anatomy could come in and say, okay, why is that happening? Well, because they haven't got enough external rotation of the hip. How could we assess external rotation of the hip, which would give them an idea as to whether they would be ready to put their foot into a half lotus or that sort of thing. But I sort of separate that. Sometimes I call it sort of medium compression because it's something getting squashed between two bones, but it really is part of a different discussion. The main joints that we think of as far as the compression happening would be the hips and the shoulders and the spine, also sometimes the ankle actually. So, and it will only be in certain directions. So for instance, at the ankle, really compression only happens in dorsiflexion. So that's the top of the foot coming towards the shin, whether your foot is still and your shin is moving, or your shin is still and your foot is moving, it's the same movement. And again, will only happen for certain individuals. And the thing is that this sort of compression is only happens towards end range of motion, whatever that may be. So it's not like you're going to experience it if you can't dorsiflex your foot at all, unless there's something really bonkers going on with your ankle. It won't be compression. It's much more likely to be soft tissue restriction. But as you get through the range of motion, then you may be experiencing compression. And sometimes that's a relief for people. I remember I came across a couple of Japanese students that had been trying to squat for maybe a couple of years, and because it's comes so easily for most Asian students, because it's part of their the Asian heritage of sitting on the floor, squatting, that sort of stuff, then they felt that they should be able to do it. So what they were doing is every day they were making sure they spent X amount of time squatting, trying to hold on to a pillar, that sort of thing, to support themselves. And it really wasn't changing. And they said to me, you know, what else do we need to do? And so I evaluated them, and actually the discomfort they were feeling was in front of, and this is one of the things with compression, is you feel it in front of the direction you want to go. They were feeling it right in that ankle crease at the front. And I said to them, look, this is compression, you're not going to go any further. So basically you can stop doing all that stuff you have been doing for the last 2 years. And they were like super relieved. It was like, oh, thank God, you know, at least we know that we're not just now going to keep wasting our time. In that particular area, you know, I don't think they would do any damage. And this is the thing. It's like only certain areas that you're, sometimes it's just good to know that basically you've stopped and that's it, you're not going to go any further. But then there's other areas like the hip, and particularly in those movements where the legs are going out to the sides, and also then when we're going down, that particularly puts a vulnerability into the hip socket itself, which is of course covered in cartilage and the labrum as well. And so it means that we could damage that. And if we lever into it and damage it, then that is going to cause ongoing issues, because it won't really repair very well. So for sure, it's only in certain directions. And so then the poses that are influenced are those poses that use those certain directions. So it won't be every hip posture, it won't be every shoulder posture. It will be those postures that involve the hip coming out, really, going into abduction, but particularly when the leg hasn't really changed its orientation much. So one of the ones that I pick up on a lot is when the legs are, when you're going into a split, shall we say, but when you haven't changed the orientation of the pelvis, so the pelvis is staying neutral, then the leg bones go out to the sides, and depending on the shape of your femoral head, or the angle that it comes out at, then that's when there's a potential for compression. So that one, and then Baddha Konasana is sort of flipped all the way around, and maybe the greater trochanter, which is that big lump of bone that sticks out the side of your hip. If that's coming in contact with the floor as you press the knees down, then it could be levering the femoral head up into the hip socket. So it's only certain postures, certain directions. And only for certain people, you know, there'd be other people that there's never going to be an issue, you know, that's just the way they're designed, as with everything. But as you mentioned at the very beginning, in a yoga class, we've got all different shapes and sizes and all different skeletal frameworks. And we need to be able to take that into account and realize that student A's reason for not being able to get their knees down, let's keep with Baddha Konasana, might not be the same reason student B's knees don't go down. And the more we can treat people as an individual, the much more likely we are to look after them properly, and also make their practice more effective, if that is what they're after, if flexibility is what they're after. And I think you just described the history of the development of my labral tear, because it was like I had a six-month affair with Ashtanga yoga, and there is that pose where you have the legs out to the side and your arms underneath. And my husband was acing that pose, and I was like, darn it, I'm gonna get there, because my hamstrings got super flexible with yoga, so I can do this. And there was the labral tear, and it took that to make me stop. And then, you know, fortunately it all healed on its own. But it is such an essential thing to know, you know, and recognize, you know, when is it when is it and I think it's not only teachers nowadays, I think as well students are, you know, and rightly so, are taking much more control of their own body and their own development. So we shouldn't always rely on the teacher to be able to experience what we're experiencing in our body, you know, particularly as they've got a number of other people that are all around them.
Yeah.
So I'm always, which is why I sort of focus on trying to make anatomy as approachable and as exciting as possible, I suppose, because what I'm hoping to do is not really just bring it to teachers, but to bring it to students, because then they will notice these things in themselves. Yeah. And that's the best thing, is if you don't have to wait really for the teacher to question what's happening in your body, but if you're experiencing it yourself and you take more charge of your own body, then you're gonna be able to guide your path much more efficiently than waiting for somebody else to do it.
Yeah, and you really need that when you become a serious yoga student. Because if you practice yoga regularly for any extended length of time, you just need to know, you know, how to work with your body safely and how to adjust. Now, there's one question we always get in these situations, and that's, what about yin yoga, which is, you know, really focusing on getting in there and holding and holding and holding and holding, with the theory that the soft tissues will eventually adjust. So
yeah,
what's your take?
How many people am I allowed to upset in one go? You know, I think it depends on of course, yin yoga, we can't really define it as such, as a clear sort of, this is what yin yoga is, because there's so many. To some people, yin yoga is different from restorative yoga. Other people, they're the same. And then there's all sorts of branches. But if we think of it as something that is for the purposes, let's say if it's more restorative in nature, then those long holds will be held in a supported way, with props and blankets. And the emphasis is more on changes to maybe the sympathetic nervous system, the calming down, and the allowing the body to rest without sleeping, shall we say. So, but if it's a yin yoga that is more holding the body or trying to travel through a range of motion unsupported, shall we say, then we come into a few things really. It's potentially problematic for those students that are already hypermobile, because their muscular tissue won't be restricting them as much as an individual that has a lot more muscular resistance, shall we say. So they'll more easily go into the ligaments, and they'll more easily go and find that compression in the joints, because their ranges of motion generally are greater. Not in all directions and not in all joints, but let's, for argument's sake, say we have a hypermobile student that's very open in the hips in all directions, shall we say. Then if she's hanging, or he or she is hanging around in a wide-legged posture that is allowing gravity or the weight of the body to take her deeper, him or her deeper, then for me, I think that's potentially problematic. And so we have that idea as to whether it's suitable for all individuals. My advice would be, if you're a hypermobile student, but you want the more relaxing, calming nature of a yin class, potentially, if that's how it's being taught, then prop yourself up. Don't hang around in the intensity of the stretch, because you just don't need it. What you need is to become stronger. And I think there's a lot more awareness about what hypermobile students need nowadays. So I think that's great. A lot of people are getting the hang of it, that it isn't just about being bendy-wendy. You want to be able to be integrated and control your ranges of motion through the whole thing. So then the other side of the coin is, you know, why do we want to hang around in these poses? What is the purpose of hanging around in these poses? And I think the idea is that the tissues will lengthen over time, and that is going to then give you a greater range of motion. Well, from my understanding, which may be different to other people's understanding, yes, the tissues will lengthen over time in a long-held posture. But what you're getting is a deformation to the material in much the same way as steel would deform if you applied a constant pressure to it, or you see it actually sometimes in old-fashioned windows in the UK. You see the glass sort of coming down in streams. But the difference being that the glass won't change back. But it's a time-dependent deformation, and it's a time-dependent reverse back to where it was. So those long holds, yes, the material that we're dealing with, the soft tissue, will change its length, but it will go back to where it was, because what the body is not really looking for is muscles that get longer. Because then if you thought about it, those individuals that were quite flexible, all their muscles would be hanging off their bodies, wouldn't they? And it really wouldn't be very useful. So what we're looking for is muscles that are allowed to lengthen. And that's different. That's the nervous system is in control of that. And so that's what we're trying to work with, is the nervous system allowing us to go deeper. And a lot of that comes from being strong and being able to show the nervous system that actually it's quite safe for me to go to these end ranges of motion, and that I can control myself in those end ranges of motion. So it's not that people won't see differences. For some people, that holding things for a long time, the nervous system will respond to that, because it's like their particular wiring is such that that makes a difference for them. For other people, it's a shorter length of time might be better, and things held in a much more dynamic way might be better. But it's however we're trying, whatever we're trying to do in whatever way, we're trying to influence the nervous system, not trying to just stretch the soft tissue to make it longer, because it would just go back to where it was. Anyway, so and that's a different mindset. And once you change your mindset around, then you start to approach things a little bit differently in the different postures. So it's not that yin yoga is ill-advised. It's just that if it suits you and you like it and it calms your nervous system down, great. If it also has the effect of, in the long term, changing your range of motion, if that's what you want, perfect. But it won't always be the cue for everybody. And also potentially people that are hypermobile need to look after themselves more.
Yeah, very good point. Great. All right, last question. You already made reference to the course you created for us on this whole topic of knowing when to stop and when to go in terms of your end range in postures. So tell us a little bit more about the course and what it contains.
Yeah, for sure. So there's two lecture sort of based formats, and then a practical as well, so as we can sort of run through some of those ideas and test it out in different places. And so we move through the major joints in the body over the two lessons. I think the first lesson was moving up the leg, so it was like ankle, knee, hip. And the second lesson was spine, shoulder, elbow, wrist. So we've covered most of the main major joints in the body, and exploring their construction in such a way that it relates, of course, to the yoga practice, and then also the directionality that we might find restrictions in, and then also how that then relates to postures that would use those restrictions. And the idea of the course was to compare that, I think we called it muscular tightness versus compression. So that idea is, well, is it going to be soft tissue that's restricting me, or is it potentially going to be compression? And we did divide compression into three types: soft, medium, and hard, without going into a lot of depth, just depending on what it is that's stopping us, whether it's flesh on flesh, or flesh getting trapped between two bones, or bone on bone. And being able to recognize that, and recognize where we might experience it, and in what place in the particular joints are we likely to experience that, and become just a little bit more aware of the sorts of things that we might experience, really, so that then we can take that information into our yoga practice, and either as a teacher be more aware of the students in front of us, or as an individual start taking more control and responsibility for our own bodies, and noticing what we should be doing. So I think we go into quite a bit of depth without making it purely for the sake of it, which is what we mentioned right at the beginning, that everything we talk about is relative to yoga, and not just abstract information, really, which is key for me.
Yeah, very good point. Wonderful. Well, Stu, thank you so much. We're really looking forward to the course. I know it contributes a lot to sort of the black holes in our yoga knowledge. And we really appreciate your time to, taking the time to share all this important knowledge with us. So thank you so much.
Thank you so much for having me, and it's been wonderful. I love any opportunity to try and share what I know, and I never make out that I know everything, but if what I do know is helpful, then that's great.
Yeah. Thanks for all that great work you're doing. It's much needed.
Thank you, Eva. Thanks.
All right. Take care. Bye-bye.
Take care. Bye now.